These are the final images taken by a hiker who supposedly lost his life in Alaska. Last summer, a hiker ventured deep into the Alaskan wilderness and never came back. When we found his campsite 3 weeks later, his gear was scattered, his tent was shredded, and his Nikon camera lay in the dirt with the lens cracked. The final 6 images on that camera showed something that should not exist, something that made my hands shake when I first saw them on the evidence room computer. A creature standing upright on 2 legs, massive and covered in dark fur, with eyes that reflected the camera flash like a wolf's. So before we continue, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you are watching from. Thanks. I have been with the Alaska State Troopers for 11 years, working mostly routine cases in the interior region. Missing hikers were not unusual in my line of work. The wilderness here is vast and unforgiving, and every summer we get calls about someone who went too far off trail or underestimated the terrain. Most of the time we find them within 48 hours, dehydrated and embarrassed but alive. Sometimes we find their remains months or years later, victims of exposure or falls or the occasional bear encounter. This case felt different from the start. The missing hiker had filed a detailed trip plan with the ranger station, listing his route and expected return date with the kind of precision that suggested experience. He carried proper gear, a satellite emergency beacon, enough food for 10 days, and that Nikon camera with its telephoto lens. He had been hiking solo through the forested valleys north of Denali, an area thick with spruce and birch where the mountains rise gradually and the trails are old mining roads that lead nowhere anymore. When he failed to check in at his scheduled time, the rangers waited the standard 24 hours before calling us. We flew a helicopter over his planned route and saw nothing from the air. The forest canopy was too dense in that region, the undergrowth too thick. We would have to go in on foot. My sergeant assigned me and 2 other troopers to lead the ground search. We loaded our packs with standard search and rescue equipment, radios, first aid supplies, evidence collection kits, and our service weapons. None of us expected to use the weapons for anything other than a possible bear deterrent. We started at the trailhead where the hiker had left his vehicle, a 10-year-old pickup truck with a parking permit still valid on the dashboard. The trail wound through dense forest for the first 3 miles, following an old roadbed that had been reclaimed by moss and ferns. The air smelled of wet earth and rotting wood. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds around our heads despite the repellent we had applied. The other 2 troopers walked ahead of me, their boots making soft sounds on the spongy ground. By midday, we reached a fork where the hiker's trip plan indicated he had planned to leave the main trail and head northwest along a creek drainage. The ground here showed old footprints in the mud, boot treads that matched the description of the missing man's hiking boots. We followed the prints along the creek, moving slowly and scanning the forest on both sides. The trees grew closer together here, their branches interlocking overhead and filtering the sunlight to a dim green glow. 3 miles up the creek drainage, we found his first campsite. The fire ring was cold and grown over with moss, suggesting it had been abandoned for at least 2 weeks. He had hung his food bag properly in a tree to keep it away from bears, though the bag was gone now, probably taken by whatever animal had found it after he left. The ground around the fire showed boot prints and nothing else. No signs of struggle, no blood, no scattered gear. He had broken camp normally and continued north. We pushed on. The terrain grew steeper and the forest thicker. By late afternoon, we reached a second campsite in a small clearing where the creek widened into a shallow pool. This site looked more disturbed. The fire ring stones were scattered, and we found a torn stuff sack hanging from a branch with its contents spilled across the ground. Freeze-dried meal packets, energy bars, and a first aid kit lay in the dirt, some of them showing teeth marks from scavengers. But it was the trees around the clearing that made us stop and look at each other without speaking. Long scratches ran down the bark of 3 different trees, gouges that started 8 feet off the ground and ran down to shoulder height. The marks were too high for a bear standing on its hind legs. They were too deep and too evenly spaced. One of the other troopers, a guy who had grown up in Alaska and knew the woods better than most, walked up to the nearest tree and placed his hand near the gouges. His fingers did not span the width between the marks. He turned and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on him before. something between confusion and the first edge of real concern. We found the camera 20 yards from the clearing, lying in the undergrowth near the base of a spruce tree. The lens was cracked, but the camera body was intact. The battery was dead. We bagged it as evidence and continued searching the area. 50 yards north of the clearing, we found the tent. It had been torn apart, the fabric shredded in long strips that hung from the branches of a willow thicket. The sleeping bag was ripped open, the down filling scattered across the ground like snow. The hiker's pack frame lay bent and broken nearby, its straps torn through. But we found no body, no blood, nothing to indicate what had happened to the man himself. We made camp as the sun dropped toward the horizon, setting up our tents in the same clearing where we had found the scattered gear. None of us wanted to stay there, but darkness was coming fast and we needed to secure the site before we lost the light. We built a large fire and kept it burning high, more for psychological comfort than warmth. The temperature was still in the 60s even after sunset, typical for an Alaskan summer night in the interior. We took turns on watch, 2 sleeping while 1 stayed awake to tend the fire and listen. During my watch shift around midnight, I heard something moving in the forest beyond our firelight. It was not the usual sounds of animals moving through undergrowth. This was heavier, more deliberate. It circled our camp at a constant distance of perhaps 50 yards. I could hear branches breaking under significant weight, and once I heard what sounded like a low rumbling breath, almost like a large dog panting, but deeper and more resonant. I woke the others. We sat together by the fire with our flashlights ready and our hands near our weapons. We listened to whatever it was continue its circuit around us for another 20 minutes, before the sounds faded into the distance. In the morning we found tracks in the soft ground at the edge of the clearing. They were unlike anything I had seen in 11 years of working in Alaska. The prints were roughly human in shape, but much larger, perhaps 18 inches long and 7 inches wide at the ball. They showed 5 distinct toes, with what looked like claw marks extending beyond each toe. The stride length between prints was over 6 feet. We photographed everything and took measurements. The tracks led north, deeper into the forest, in the same direction the hiker had apparently been traveling. We called in our findings to the sergeant. He told us to proceed with caution, suggested that we might be dealing with an unusually large brown bear despite the odd track morphology. He authorized us to continue the search for 1 more day before calling in additional resources. We broke camp and followed the tracks north, moving in a tight formation with our radios on and our bear spray ready. The forest grew darker as we went, the spruce trees older and more densely packed, their lower branches dead and hanging like broken fingers. Around noon, we found the Nikon camera's memory card reader in the dirt, as if the hiker had been reviewing his photos when something interrupted him. We had the camera itself, so this was just the small USB adapter he would have used to transfer images to a laptop. The fact that it was here suggested he had been in the process of backing up his photos. He knew he had captured something significant and wanted to preserve it. That thought made my stomach tight. What had he seen that was important enough to document even as whatever was following him grew closer? By early afternoon, we reached a steep hillside where the tracks led up through a maze of fallen logs and thick devil's club. The other troopers started up the slope, but I stopped at the bottom and looked at the ground more carefully. There were more tracks here, lots of them, coming from different directions and converging on a game trail that led up the hill. Some of the prints were smaller than others. Some showed a different gait pattern, as if the creatures that made them were moving on all fours instead of upright. I counted at least 3 different sizes of prints in the mud. I called the others back and showed them what I had found. We stood there looking at the tracks and at the dark forest rising above us, and I think that was the moment when we all understood that we were not searching for a missing hiker anymore. We were in something's territory, and that something was aware of our presence. One of the troopers, the youngest of us, suggested we return to the trailhead and call in for helicopter support. The other trooper argued that we needed to keep searching, that the missing man might still be alive and in need of immediate help. I made the decision to continue, but to stay together and to be ready to retreat at the first sign of direct threat. We climbed the hillside slowly, checking every shadow, every fallen log, every thick patch of undergrowth. The forest was absolutely silent. No birds called, No squirrels chattered. Even the mosquitoes seemed to have disappeared. It was the kind of silence that speaks of predators. The absence of sound that comes when everything smaller has gone to ground and is waiting for danger to pass. My heart beat hard enough that I could feel it in my throat. Sweat soaked through my shirt despite the cool air under the trees. At the top of the hillside, we found a flattened area where something large had bedded down in the moss. The depression was roughly 8 feet long and 4 feet wide, shaped like the outline of a massive body. The moss was pressed flat, and the ground underneath was still slightly warm to the touch. Whatever had been here had left recently, possibly when it heard us climbing the hill. Around the bedding area we found more tracks, dozens of them, and what looked like drag marks leading downhill to the east. We followed the drag marks. They led to a ravine choked with alder bushes and crossed by a small stream. On the far side of the stream, caught on a branch and fluttering in the breeze, we found a piece of torn fabric. It matched the description of the missing hiker's jacket. The fabric was stained but not with blood. It smelled of something else, a musky animal odor that was both familiar and alien at the same time. We searched the ravine carefully but found no body, no other pieces of equipment, nothing to indicate the hiker's final location. What we did find was a series of worn paths through the alder, tunnels really, where something had pushed through the dense brush repeatedly over time. The paths were too high to be moose runs and too wide to be bear trails. They radiated out from the ravine in multiple directions, creating a network that suggested these paths were regularly used and maintained. One of the paths led to a rocky overhang where we found scratch marks on the stone, similar to the ones we had seen on the trees, but deeper and more numerous. The rock face was covered with them, layers upon layers of claw marks that must have accumulated over years or decades. I have heard stories about Dogman since I was a kid growing up in rural Michigan. My grandfather used to tell tales about encounters in the North Woods, creatures that walked like men but had the heads and fur of wolves. I had always dismissed those stories as folklore, the same category as Bigfoot or lake monsters, entertaining campfire tales with no basis in reality. But standing there in that Alaskan ravine, looking at those tracks and those claw marks and that torn piece of jacket, I found myself remembering those old stories with new attention. The native peoples of Alaska have their own versions of these legends, stories about the Kushtaka or land otter men, shapeshifters that lure travelers off the path. The Athabascan tribes speak of the Nantina, giant wild men covered in hair, who steal game and occasionally take people who venture too far into the wilderness alone. Every culture that lives close to deep forests seems to have stories about things that walk upright, but are not human. In Wisconsin and Michigan, they call it the Beast of Bray Road, or simply Dogman. In the Appalachians, it goes by different names, Dark Dog or the Black Beast. In the Pacific Northwest, it gets mixed up with Bigfoot sightings, though people who claim to have seen both say they are different creatures. Dogman is a predator, aggressive and territorial. Bigfoot is shy and avoids humans. Dogman has a canine head with a pronounced snout and visible teeth. Bigfoot has a more ape-like face. The tracks are different too. Bigfoot prints are flat and wide. Dogman prints show claw marks and a more elongated shape. The first modern reports of Dogman came out of Michigan in the late 1800s. Though indigenous stories go back much further. Lumber workers reported encounters with creatures that walked on 2 legs and had the faces of wolves. Most of these accounts were dismissed as tall tales or the result of isolation and imagination. In 1987, a radio DJ in Michigan recorded a song called The Legend, which told the story of Dogman sightings that supposedly occurred every 10 years. The song was meant as an April Fool's Day joke, but within weeks, the station was flooded with calls from people claiming to have had genuine encounters. The pattern was consistent across reports. Witnesses described a creature 7 to 8 feet tall, covered in dark fur with a wolf-like head and powerful shoulders. It moved on 2 legs, but could drop to all 4s for speed. Its eyes reflected light like an animal's. It made sounds that ranged from deep growls to howls that did not quite match any known wolf or coyote call. Most encounters happened at dusk or dawn, in forested areas away from main roads. The creatures seemed to avoid direct confrontation, but were not afraid of humans. They would watch from the tree line, pace vehicles on remote roads, or circle camps at night. A few encounters turned aggressive, usually when people had wandered into what appeared to be established territories. The Native American stories went back generations. The Ojibwe spoke of the Wendigo, though that was usually described as a spirit rather than a physical creature. But they also had stories of forest guardians, beings that kept watch over sacred places and would drive off intruders. The Cree had similar tales. The descriptions varied, but certain elements remained constant. These were creatures of the deep forest, intelligent and territorial, capable of moving silently despite their size. They lived in family groups, had established territories, and would defend those territories against perceived threats. They were primarily nocturnal but could be active during day in remote areas. They avoided human settlement but would occasionally raid camps for food. I had never believed any of it, but I was starting to reconsider my skepticism. We decided to head back down the hill and return to our camp to recharge equipment and review what we had found. The sun was getting lower and none of us wanted to be on that hillside after dark. We moved quickly, almost running in places, and we kept our voices low and our eyes on the forest around us. Twice I heard sounds pacing us through the trees, heavy footfalls that stopped when we stopped and resumed when we started moving again. We were being followed. Whatever lived here was tracking us the same way we had been tracking it. We reached our clearing just before sunset. The fire we had built that morning was scattered, the stones kicked apart and the half-burned logs thrown into the undergrowth. Our tents were still standing, but one of them had been approached. We could see fresh tracks in the dirt around it and scratches on the tent fabric where something had tested the material with its claws. We rebuilt the fire quickly and gathered our gear into the center of the clearing. The plan was to wait for full dark and then use our flashlights and night vision to try to observe whatever was out there. But we needed to review the camera first. Back at camp, I had brought a portable battery pack and a laptop for processing evidence. I connected the dead Nikon to the battery pack and let it charge for 20 minutes while we ate a cold meal and checked our weapons. None of us spoke much. The forest around us was silent again, that oppressive absence of normal sound that made every tiny noise we made seem loud and exposed. When the camera had enough charge to turn on, I connected it to the laptop and began downloading the images. The first 30 photos were normal hiking shots, beautiful landscapes of mountains and forest, close-ups of wildflowers, a few pictures of a moose feeding in a willow marsh. Then the images changed. Photo 31 showed a distant figure standing in trees, too far away to make out details, but clearly large and upright. Photo 32 was similar, but closer, taken from maybe 100 yards away. The figure was dark against the green forest, its posture distinctly non-human despite the bipedal stance. Photos 33 through 35 showed the figure closer still, and now you could make out features. A massive body covered in dark fur, arms that hung longer than human proportions, a head that was not human. The final image, number 36, was the one that had been taken just before the camera was dropped. It showed the creature at perhaps 20 yards distance, standing in the middle of a game trail and looking directly at the camera. The flash had caught its eyes and made them reflect green, like a dog's eyes in headlights. The face was elongated, lupine, with a pronounced snout and visible teeth. The ears were pointed and set high on the head. The body was enormously muscular, the shoulders broader than any human, the arms ending in hands that showed both fingers and prominent claws. It was standing fully upright, its posture more human than animal, but everything about it was wrong. I showed the images to the other troopers. We sat there in the firelight, looking at the laptop screen and not speaking. What do you say when you realize that something from folklore and late-night campfire stories is real? What do you do when your training and experience provide no framework for understanding what you are seeing? Finally, the youngest trooper asked if we should send the images back to the sergeant. I made the decision to wait. I wanted to be sure of what we were dealing with before I put this in an official report. The moment these images went into the system, our careers would be defined by them, for better or worse. We set up a watch rotation again, 2 sleeping while 1 stayed awake by the fire. I took the first shift. The forest remained silent for the first hour, and then I began to hear sounds. Movement in the undergrowth, heavy and deliberate, the snap of branches being pushed aside, a low huffing breath that sounded like a large dog scenting the air. Then I saw eyes reflecting in the darkness beyond our firelight. Multiple pairs of them, positioned at different heights and different distances. They did not blink, they simply watched. I woke the others quietly. We sat together and watched those eyes watch us. There were at least 5 pairs that I could count, maybe more in the deeper darkness beyond our sight. They stayed just outside the firelight's reach, holding position at the edge of visibility. One set of eyes was positioned high, at least 7 feet off the ground. Others were lower, perhaps 5 feet up, suggesting either smaller individuals or creatures in a crouched position. They did not approach. They simply maintained their perimeter around our camp, holding us in place without engaging. This went on for 3 hours. We fed the fire constantly, keeping the flames high and bright. We did not speak above whispers. Every time one of us moved, every time we shifted position or added wood to the fire, those eyes would shift slightly, tracking the movement. They were studying us, I realized, evaluating us, deciding what we were and whether we represented a threat or an opportunity. The thought made my mouth dry. We were not the investigators here. We were being investigated. Around 2 a.m, the eyes disappeared. One moment they were there, reflecting the firelight from the darkness, and the next moment they were gone. The forest remained silent. We stayed awake the rest of the night, taking turns watching different approaches to our clearing. We saw nothing more. As dawn began to lighten the sky, birds started calling again, and squirrels appeared in the trees. The normal sounds of the forest resumed, and with them came an overwhelming sense of relief that made my hands shake when I tried to pour coffee from our thermos. We broke camp at first light. The decision was made without discussion. We packed our gear quickly and started back down the trail toward the trailhead in our vehicle. This was no longer a search and rescue operation. The hiker was gone, almost certainly dead. We had neither the training nor the equipment to recover his remains from whatever had taken him. We needed to get out of this territory, make our report, and let people with more specialized knowledge decide how to proceed. We moved fast, almost jogging in places, and we did not stop to rest. 2 miles from our clearing, we found a tree that had been stripped of its bark in a spiral pattern, the exposed wood showing fresh claw marks. 1 mile farther, we found a deer carcass hanging from a branch, partially eaten and left to drain. The deer had been positioned deliberately, suspended at eye level across the trail in a display that seemed designed to mark territory or warn intruders. We circled around it and kept moving. I could hear sounds pacing us again through the forest. Multiple sets of footfalls moving parallel to our route. They stayed out of sight but made no effort to conceal their presence. The message was clear. We were being escorted to the boundary of the territory, watched until we left. When we finally reached the trailhead and saw our vehicle waiting in the parking area, I felt a physical wave of relief so intense that I had to stop and lean against a tree for a moment to steady myself. We loaded our gear and climbed into the truck. I started the engine and pulled out onto the dirt access road, accelerating faster than was safe on the rough surface. None of us spoke until we were back on paved highway and could see buildings and other vehicles. Only then did the tension begin to ease. At the trooper station, I made my report to the sergeant. I described the destroyed campsite, the strange tracks, the torn equipment, and the systematic surveillance of our own camp. I showed him the images from the camera. He looked at them for a long time without speaking, then closed the laptop and looked at me with an expression I could not read. He asked if I thought the missing hiker could still be alive. I told him no. He asked if I thought we could recover the body. I told him that I did not think there was a body to recover. The sergeant made some calls. Within 2 days, a team from Fish and Wildlife arrived, along with a couple of federal agents whose specific department was never clearly identified. They interviewed all 3 of us separately, asking detailed questions about everything we had seen and heard. They took custody of the camera and all of our photographs. They told us that the case was being reclassified as an animal attack and that we should not discuss the details with anyone outside of official channels. The missing hiker's family would be told that their loved one was lost in the wilderness and presumed deceased, cause of death undetermined. The case would remain open, but inactive. I heard later, through unofficial channels, that the special team went back into that area with some kind of specialized tracking equipment. They found more evidence, more tracks, what they described as a den site with remains that they did not detail. They placed the entire valley under a quiet travel restriction, using some forestry regulation about erosion control or wildlife nesting grounds. It was not a hard closure, just enough bureaucracy to discourage casual hikers from going in without an official permit. The permits, I was told, were rarely approved. As for me, I requested a transfer to a different region. I still work for the state troopers, but now I stick to the coastal areas where the forests are thinner and the population density is higher. I have not been back into the deep interior wilderness since that summer. I know what I saw and what I heard and what those tracks in the mud represented. I know that there are things living in the vast forests of Alaska that we do not talk about in polite company, things that our official wildlife surveys do not acknowledge, things that are very good at remaining hidden when they want to be. The indigenous peoples have known about these creatures for thousands of years. Their stories describe them with remarkable consistency across different tribes and different regions. They are territorial, intelligent, and extremely dangerous when provoked or when defending their territory. They hunt cooperatively in family groups. They are most active at dawn and dusk. They avoid humans when possible but will eliminate perceived threats without hesitation. The stories also say that these creatures are few in number, that they stick to the deepest wilderness areas, and that they have learned through generations to avoid human contact whenever possible. Modern sightings and encounters are increasing, probably because human activity is pushing deeper into previously untouched wilderness areas. Hikers, hunters, and researchers are going farther off trail into territories that have been the exclusive domain of these creatures for longer than recorded history. Most encounters end with the person retreating, frightened but unharmed. Some encounters end differently. The missing hiker was one of those exceptions, someone who either pushed too far into a protected territory or encountered an individual that was less tolerant of human presence. I think about those final images often, especially the last one where the creature is staring directly into the camera. What was the hiker thinking in that moment? Did he understand what he was looking at? Did he know that he was about to be attacked? Or was he still operating under the assumption that this was some known animal, a bear maybe, or a particularly large wolf? Something that would eventually move on and let him continue his hike? I will never know. But I know that he captured proof of something that most people believe does not exist, and that proof is now buried somewhere in a government archive where it will never see public light. The scientific community dismisses Dogman sightings as misidentifications of known animals, hallucinations, or hoaxes, and maybe 99% of reported sightings are exactly that. But that 1%, the cases like ours, where multiple trained observers see the same thing, where physical evidence exists, where the encounter follows patterns consistent with an actual biological entity rather than folklore, those cases are harder to explain away. I am not a cryptozoologist. I am not someone who goes looking for monsters. I am a law enforcement officer with over a decade of experience in wilderness search and rescue, and I'm telling you that something is out there, something that has learned to stay hidden, to avoid cameras and documentation, to maintain territories in the vast wilderness areas that humans rarely visit. If you are planning to hike in remote areas, especially in Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, the Upper Midwest, or the Appalachians, take the warnings seriously. The signs that you are entering Dogman territory are consistent. Unusual quiet, where the normal forest sounds stop. Trees with claw marks that are too high for bears. A persistent feeling of being watched. Tracks that do not match any known animal. Strange howls or vocalizations that do not sound like wolves or coyotes. Game trails that are too large and too worn for normal wildlife. If you see these signs, turn back. Do not push deeper. Do not assume you are safe because you have a weapon or because you are in a group. These creatures are apex predators that have been surviving in wilderness environments for thousands of years. They know their territory better than you ever will. They can move silently through dense undergrowth. They can track prey for miles without being detected. They are intelligent enough to understand when they are being pursued and can adapt their behavior accordingly. I still have nightmares about that night sitting by the fire and watching those eyes watch us back. In my dreams, they keep getting closer, stepping into the firelight, and I can see them fully. I wake up before that happens, my heart racing and my shirt soaked with sweat. The other 2 troopers who were with me on that search have their own ways of dealing with what we saw. One of them quit the force entirely and moved to Anchorage, where he works security for a shopping mall. The other one still works wilderness patrol but refuses to go into certain areas, finding excuses to assign those calls to other officers. We do not talk about it among ourselves. There is an unspoken understanding that discussing it only makes the memories more vivid, keeps them closer to the surface. But I know they remember. I can see it in their eyes when we pass each other in the hallways at the station. We share something that sets us apart from our colleagues, who have never ventured into those deep territories. The missing hiker's family eventually held a memorial service without a body. I attended, though I stayed in the back and left before the reception. What could I tell them? That their son or brother or husband had documented his own final moments in photographs, that he had stumbled into territory claimed by creatures that should not exist, that his encounter was probably marked by terror and confusion as he realized too late what was happening. The official story was kinder, vague enough to let them imagine a peaceful end from exposure or a quick accident. Sometimes the truth serves no purpose except to deepen pain. I keep a copy of those 6 images on an encrypted drive in my personal safe. I'm not supposed to have them, but I need to be able to look at them occasionally, to remind myself that what I experienced was real and not some stress-induced hallucination. The last image still makes my chest tight when I see it. Those eyes reflecting green in the camera flash, the bared teeth, the massive shoulders and the wrong proportions of the arms, the sense of intelligence behind that face, an intelligence that was evaluating the hiker as prey. That image is burned into my memory with a clarity that has not faded even slightly in the months since that summer. Some creatures are meant to remain in the realm of legend and folklore. They serve a purpose there, warning us away from dangerous places, teaching us to respect the wilderness and recognize the limits of our knowledge. But when the legend becomes real, when you find yourself face to face with something that mythology assured you did not exist, your entire understanding of the world has to shift. You realize that the maps are not complete, that the official wildlife surveys are missing species, that there are gaps in our knowledge large enough to hide apex predators that have learned to avoid our surveillance. The world is larger and stranger than we admit in our scientific journals and our official reports. I have been asked several times by friends and family why I requested a transfer, why I suddenly wanted to leave the interior wilderness work that I had always seemed to love. I tell them I wanted a change of pace, that I was ready for something different. That is not entirely untrue, but the full truth is that I learned respect for boundaries I did not know existed. I learned that some territories are claimed by things far more dangerous than bears or wolves. And I learned that when those things give you a warning, when they let you see their eyes in the darkness and watch you without attacking, you should take that as a gift and leave while you still can. The Forest Service has quietly increased patrol presence in that valley, though they cite routine wilderness management as the reason. Permits for solo hiking in the region are heavily discouraged, and groups are required to carry satellite emergency beacons and check in daily. The official explanation involves concerns about increased bear activity and difficult terrain. The real reason is never stated in any official documentation, but those of us who know, who have seen the evidence and read the reports that do not get filed in public records, we understand what those precautions are really about. Last month I heard about another incident in a similar area, this time in northern Wisconsin. A bow hunter had been found deceased, his tree stand destroyed, his equipment scattered over a wide area. The official cause of death was listed as a fall from the tree stand during what appeared to be an encounter with a large predator. But the hunter's trail camera had been found with its memory card removed. Someone or something had known enough to take the card before investigators arrived. The hunter's family was told there was no retrievable footage. I suspect there was footage, and I suspect it showed something that officials decided the public did not need to see. These cases happen more often than people realize, but they are kept quiet, explained away, buried in paperwork that discourages further investigation. A hiker disappears in Olympic National Forest. A camper is found deceased in the Boundary Waters, with their tent destroyed and their belongings scattered. A researcher goes missing in the North Cascades and is never found. The official explanations are always bears or exposure or tragic accidents, but sometimes the details do not quite add up. The tracks are wrong. The damage to equipment shows intelligence rather than animal behavior. Witnesses report sounds or sightings that do not match any known wildlife. I sometimes wonder if the creatures understand that we are protecting them through our silence. Do they know that by staying hidden, by taking only the occasional hiker or hunter who goes too deep, they maintain their survival? Do they understand that if their existence was publicly confirmed, if those images were released to the media and the scientific community was forced to acknowledge them, their territories would be invaded? Researchers and hunters and curiosity seekers who would not respect the boundaries that locals have learned to observe would flood these areas. Perhaps that is why they let us go that night, why they watched but did not attack. Perhaps they understood that we were not a threat to their continued existence, as long as we carried our knowledge quietly rather than shouting it from official platforms. The Nikon camera with its cracked lens sits in an evidence locker somewhere in a state facility I no longer have access to. The images have been copied to multiple classified servers, analyzed by specialists whose credentials I was never told, and filed away in databases that most people do not know exist. The missing hiker's name appears in statistical reports about wilderness deaths, one number among dozens that occur in Alaska every year. His story is a cautionary tale about proper preparation and the dangers of solo wilderness travel. The truth of what happened to him, the reality of what he photographed in those final moments, remains locked away where it cannot disturb the comfortable narrative. The narrative that says we have identified and catalogued all the dangerous species in our forests, that the wilderness is mapped and understood, that creatures from folklore are just stories told around campfires to entertain. But I know. And the other two troopers know. And the federal agents who came and took over the case, they know. And somewhere in the Alaska wilderness, in valleys and forests that appear on maps but are rarely visited, those creatures know. They know that they have been seen, photographed, documented. They know that a few humans carry the knowledge of their existence, and they continue to do what they have always done, maintaining their territories, hunting their prey, and avoiding contact with humans whenever possible. The balance holds for now, maintained through mutual understanding that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. If you venture into deep wilderness, respect the silence, respect the signs, respect the boundaries that you may not see, but that are enforced by things far older and more powerful than park regulations. And if you see eyes reflecting in your flashlight beam, if you hear sounds that do not match any animal you can name, if you find tracks that make you question everything you thought you knew about wildlife, turn back. Do not investigate. Do not try to photograph it. Do not assume that your modern equipment and your rational mind will protect you from things that have survived in the wilderness for thousands of years by being smarter and stronger than anything that crossed their path. The hiker made that mistake. His final photographs are beautiful in a terrible way, documentation of a truth that most people are lucky enough never to face. I have seen that truth, and I choose to respect it by keeping my distance. For more stories like this, consider subscribing to our channel.